Did Edie Howe just make that up?
Stone in the Hat accounts came from people misunderstanding things that they saw. Joseph couldn't preserve his privacy. So what would he do if somebody burst in on them when he was translating with the plates and the interpreters? He'd hide the interpreters underneath and the plates underneath his hat. Either Joseph got the plates and the interpreters back after the Lost Pages episode, or he didn't. Both things can't be true.
Can't keep quiet when you start a riot.
There was a lot of folk magic going on, and the Smith family kind of, played around with that.
Yeah, pretty cool. Based.
Basically, that would mean all the Book of Mormon we have today came from this here Stone in the Hat.
All of the scriptural references used in this episode will be brought to you by scripturenotes.com. For a free trial to Scripture Notes, please visit the link in the description. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to Ward Radio. I'm your host, Cardinellis, and today I'm joined in the studio by Luke Hansen, editor-in-chief of Ward Radio News, as well as via Zoom by none other than James Lucas, acclaimed author from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who just wrote a recent book by means of the Urim and Thummim, which is available for purchase today, and is a response. This is kind of a response video to this challenge that apparently I don't remember, but did indeed issue in our latest video with Richard Bushman, that he's smelling what we're stepping in. He is picking up what we're putting down. He's responding to this challenge here.
There's a great controversy now about the seer stones.
Yeah.
And two scholars, Jim Lucas and Jonathan Neville, are contesting that.
It's such an odd little controversy.
An odd one, because it isn't Mormon versus non-Mormon believer. It's Mormons themselves are debating this issue. They're all believers.
Do you hear that, Jim Lucas? Do you hear that, Jonathan Neville? We're coming for you. No, I'm just kidding.
All right. So you are here to actually respond, to put the smack down. And hey, look, we actually had somebody respond to an on-screen challenge. Do you see that, Luke? Like, this doesn't happen every day. This is pretty awesome. All right. So I did say in the video, I believe, Luke, if I'm not mistaken, that this is like an odd little controversy that has indeed developed, right? So really fast, James, can you give us a refresher? What is this controversy about? Like, did or did not Joseph Smith use a seer stone or the Urim and Thummim, or are we mislabeling it? I can't explain it all, but explain for our audience what the controversy is and what both sides of this argument are, so we can like get to the bottom of this. Jim Lucas, go.
Okay. So the primary people involved in the translating the Book of Mormon were Joseph Smith, the translator, and the primary scribe was Oliver Cowdery.
Yeah.
So initially, they didn't, in the early 1830s, they didn't say too much about how that translation was carried out. However, in 1834, the first major anti-Mormon book came out. It was called Mormonism Unveiled by Edie Howe. And it was a big book. And it's a fascinating book because you still hear today many of the arguments that are in that book.
Yeah.
That is the book where you first had a full exposition of the idea that the Book of Mormon came about because Joseph would take the seer stone, or the scrying stone that he used as a treasure digger to do it, and he put it in a hat, stick his face into the hat, and dictate the Book of Mormon. And that was one of the theories that Edie Howe put forth in the Mormonism Unveiled. It's also the first real exposition of the Spalding theory, that Joseph was reading off of the a manuscript that Sidney Rigdon had acquired from a man named Solomon Spalding.
So is that theory, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but so is that theory that, okay, so anti-Mormon rule like number 8 or 9 is they constantly recycle old lies. Like there's never anything new. And right. I'm just intrigued as I find how old some of these tropes are. Did Edie Howe just make that up?
It's not clear where Edie Howe got that particular theory from. There were a couple of newspaper articles saying that Joseph put his spectacles in the hat. Now, the spectacles were 2 stones in a wire rim. That's a description of the Urim and Thummim.
Okay.
So those accounts were around, but it's and of course his book is full of the Phlastus Hurlbut affidavits.
Yeah.
So it's a big book, and it's got a lot of documentation in it. You know, he that's where all the Phlastus Hurlbut affidavits are, claiming that the Smiths were lazy, a bunch of lazy bums and stupid, ignorant people and superstitious and so forth. So that's where all that stuff comes from. So this book, Mormonism Unveiled, is a fascinating book because it was a big book. It was the first anti-Mormon book, and you still hear today stuff that was in E.D. Howe that originated in the Mormonism Unveiled. Your rule is proven by this book because basically a lot of the arguments that E.D. Howe used in 1834, they just come back and back, and we hear them again today with variations. But it's fascinating when you're familiar with this book and you listen to anti-Mormon arguments. It's almost amusing because you can sit there and say, yeah, you're 200 years out on you think you've come up with a brand new argument, but your E.D. Howe was there 200 years ago, friend. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So any event.
I was going to say, so like anti-Mormonism, like 2014 to 2019 was all about like, oh, I'm so hip because I read the CES letter and now I challenge the truth claims of the church. And the number one thing that you would just hear them just regurgitate onto like Reddit or just regurgitate onto Facebook was like, we've been lied to, stone in the hat. We've been lied to, stone in the hat. And, I remember talking about this kind of stuff like when I was a kid even, so I don't know how anybody could say that this was like not part of the conversation, but that's what they do. And they say, we were lied to. And, it wasn't until Richard Bushman validated that we actually knew that this actually happened and all that other junk. Okay. But you're saying that this actually goes back to like the first anti-Mormon book, and it really might just be a trope that in reality, it's not that we were lied to, but that as people dissect the history, they might have accidentally started believing anti-Mormon lies and just like incorporated them into the zeitgeist. Kind of like there's some people that actually think Joseph Smith like cut down a cherry tree. It's like no, that wasn't. Now that's not anti-American propaganda, but still, it's like that's something that didn't happen that now some people misinterpret as actual history. Am I understanding you correctly?
Well, let me kind of continue with a quick overview.
Okay.
So that book came out in 1834. There had been a couple of newspaper accounts from non-LDS sources that would have been all hearsay about something in a hat before then, but really E.D. Howe is one who put it all together. So and that was 1834. So starting in 1835, Joseph and Oliver, who were at that time the first elder and second elder, or the president and assistant president of the church, began to make published statements describing the translation process, which they hadn't done before, that they put out statement after statement for the rest of their lives, saying that the translation of the Book of Mormon came about through the Urim and Thummim. They used that term Urim and Thummim, but they always would say, which came with the plates. So we knew what they were talking about here was not the seer stone, which didn't come with the plates. It was the 2 spectacles or 2 stones in wire rims, which looked like old-fashioned granny glasses that were eventually picked up the name Urim and Thummim. That was the instrument, and these are a whole different thing than the seer stone. These, if you look D&C 17, these were created at the time of the brother Jared. They were, created at the same time the brother Jared went up to get his 16 glowing stones for his boats, the Lord also made the 2 interpreter seer stones. And so these date back to the Jaredite times. They were preserved by the Jaredites. They were preserved by the Nephites. And, they went all the way down to Mormon and Moroni. And then Moroni put them in the box with the gold plates this is Joseph Smith history in the Pearl of Great Price section, verse 35, for the purpose of translating the records. And that's what the scriptures say. So Joseph and Oliver, we have in the book a whole appendix. It's about 25 pages long, full of written published statements from Joseph and Oliver saying the Book of Mormon is translated with the Urim and Thummim, which came with the plates. And that's the means by which the Book of Mormon was translated, coming from the gold plates. So that was, pretty, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, the translator and the scribe of the vast majority of the dictation that Joseph gave, pretty authoritative sources. So that's what pretty much everybody went by, but not everybody. So what happened was that in the basically starting about the 1870s, there were some, by then Joseph had been killed. Oliver also had passed away. He died in 1850. And and then there was the breakup of the church following the martyrdom of Joseph Smith. And, large numbers of people followed Brigham Young to Utah. Yeah. A lot of people stayed in the Midwest, and there were a lot of different, groups that scattered. So there was a real kind of dispersion of the Latter-day Saint movement at that time. So some of the dissidents started to kind of question the main narrative, the Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery narrative. And so you had the primary person was David Whitmer. Now, David Whitmer had never been he was never a scribe. There's no evidence that he ever really was claimed to actually have witnessed the translation process. He wasn't in Harmony, except he came down to pick up Joseph Oliver and take them up to his family's home in Fayette to finish the plates of Nephi translation. But the majority of the Book of Mormon, all of the Mormon parts of the Book of Mormon, from the Mosiah through to the Book of Moroni, were done in Harmony. And, David Whitmer wasn't anywhere around. But he was very prominent in the church in the beginning. And then he and his family, they were in Missouri in the 1830s, and during the persecutions there, they separated from the church. And that's a whole long, elaborate story that we won't go into. But, they were excommunicated, but, they felt they shouldn't have been. And so they stayed in Missouri, and they made peace with the anti-Mormon mob, and they just kind of settled there and actually started their own little church, although they never really proselyted a lot. Another character, of course, was Emma, who was for some short period of time a scribe, but mostly on the lost pages that Martin Harris lost. And so she made a couple of statements that Joseph used the seer stone. However, it's not clear. However, neither David Whitmer nor Emma Smith were ever authorized to see the interpreters or the plates. So now David Whitmer eventually saw them when he became one of the 3 witnesses, but that was after the translation was done. Emma never saw the plates or the interpreters. And it's interesting because the Whitmer mother was shown the plates at one point. So it wasn't that it was only a priesthood thing and women weren't allowed to see them. But for some reason, the Lord never gave permission for Emma to see the plates and the interpreters. So she kind of So when she and Martin Harris were translating, they were the scribes for the lost pages. There would be a blanket. And Martin Harris, there's accounts from Martin Harris describing this, that would separate Joseph from the scribe. And you see this sometimes in some of the illustrations, because neither Martin Harris or Emma Smith at the time were authorized to see the plates and the interpreters. Now, we believe later that Oliver was authorized because he was given permission to translate, so he could see everything.
Was that like a blanket authorization then? Like he saw them regularly, is what you think?
We think that he did see them regularly once he was authorized to try to translate.
Okay, so what's the lie and who's spreading it, and what's the false record and how do we correct it?
Okay, so in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the folks in Utah began, they just went with what Oliver and Joseph said. They said it was from the plates, the gold plates, using the interpreters, the Urim and Thummim. And that was the story that was in the church all the way up until the 1980s, 1990s. And that's the story that people who, claim that they were lied to, that's the story that they grew up with. And because that's the story the church told, because the church believed Joseph and Oliver were the best sources. Then, however, a couple of people began to go with the seer stone. There's a couple of accounts from Emma Smith, and there's really only a couple of accounts from Emma Smith where she seems to think that things were done with the seer stone after the lost pages. In other words, after Martin Harris lost the pages. But the main character who really pushed the seer stone was David Whitmer, who had never been a witness to the translation process ever.
Okay.
But what happened was, so after he was put out or left the church, was excommunicated, put out of the church, whatever, in the 1830s, David Whitmer, he really stewed about that. So he was pretty quiet for several decades, but by the 1870s, he began to get active again. And so he started to go around, and he's the one who really actively spread, him and another guy named William McClellan, who was also an apostate member who was not a witness to the translation process. They began to really push the seer stone account. And because David Whitmer was the last surviving witness of the Book of Mormon, he lived in Missouri, so he wasn't out there in Utah, way far away from newspapers and so forth. He gave tons of interviews, and he was, everybody would come and see him. He'd give interviews to people. So there's tons of interviews that he gave. And at the very end of his life, in the late 1880s, he published a little booklet in which he set forth his views, including the whole seer stone account. So that's the origin of the seer stone account. And that is, originated with E.D. Howe in 1834 with the Mormonism Unveiled. But the sources that Richard Bushman is referring to are these sources that I've described, from a couple of quotes from Emma Smith, but mostly David Whitmer.
So do you think that the seer stone account was basically a fabrication of David Whitmer during his kind of inactive years, that was a tool of self-aggrandizement that kind of got ahead of him and got out of his hands? Is that what we're suggesting here, or what?
No. So here's the, so now rush forward. So there's another Richard that we have to bring into the picture.
Okay, cool.
A historian named Richard Lloyd Anderson.
Okay, gotcha.
To you?
Oh, yeah, it does.
Okay.
Why? Why does it not ring a bell to me? Who is this guy?
Luke, do you want to, so nobody's just listening to me for hours and hours and hours?
Oh,
there you go.
Cool, there it is.
That is like the definitive work on the Book of Mormon witnesses. So Richard Lloyd Anderson, he passed away about 5-10 years ago, but he was a history professor at BYU, and his specialty was the Book of Mormon Witnesses. He was the expert. So that book that Luke just held up, I mean, that was published like in the 1970s, I think.
Wow,
But
okay.
that
I think
is
so.
still regarded as the definitive book on the Book of Mormon Witnesses. So Richard Lloyd Anderson, he was, kind of bothered by this over his whole career. So I have researched all of his books, and I even went to BYU and got his papers, which had not been cataloged yet. I went through all of his papers.
Really?
To really
Okay.
understand what his views were on this. And what happened was that Richard Lloyd Anderson noticed that there was this discrepancy between Oliver Cowdery's, he called it the early Cowdery and the late Whitmer. That was kind of how he phrased it. Oliver saying there was the Urim and Thummim interpreters that came with the plates, and lots and lots of accounts from David Whitmer, because he got interviewed so many times and so forth, saying, no, after Martin Harris lost the pages, the angel took back the plates and the interpreters and it never gave them back to Joseph. And so that's why Joseph had to use the seer stone in the hat. And basically that would mean all the Book of Mormon we have today came from the seer stone in the hat.
Okay.
If you take that David Whitmer's story, his account.
Uh-huh.
So Richard Lloyd Anderson was, puzzled by this. This was a contradiction, and you can't mush them together. Either Joseph got the plates and the interpreters back after the Lost Pages episode, or he didn't. Both things can't be true. Yeah. Joseph and Oliver said he lost. The angel took them back, but then he returned them, and that's what was used to translate the Book of Mormon that we have. David Whitmer clearly stated and argued that no, the angel never gave the plates and interpreters back to Joseph, and therefore all of the Book of Mormon we have came out of the stone in the hat, because that's the only thing, that's what Joseph had to use. Mm-hmm. And he says this in right. This is not, an interpretation of what David Whitmer said. This is very clearly what David Whitmer said in his interviews. He put in that booklet. So this was the David Whitmer position. They're absolutely contradictory. Both cannot be true. So Richard Lloyd Anderson, who was the expert on the witnesses, this really bugged him. And so he eventually came to the conclusion that what happened was that 40 years from the 1830s to the 1880s when he died, or is that 50 years? David Whitmer was stewing. He was hating on Joseph Smith. He was very angry. He was very bitter about being put out of the church in the 1830s. He felt Joseph had cheated him, that he'd done him wrong. And he just stewed about this. He didn't say much for about 20 or 30 years. But finally, in the 1870s, 1880s, David Whitmer let loose. And he basically came to he argued that Joseph was a fallen prophet. So because David was a witness of the Book of Mormon, because he had his angelic vision, he never denied that. Mm-hmm. He always affirmed that. So you got to give him credit for that. But basically, David Whitmer's argument was, from the minute that the Book of Mormon was finished, Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet. He rejected everything else that Joseph did. He rejected the Doctrine and Covenants. He rejected the restoration of the priesthood. He rejected the organization of the church. He rejected the name of the church. He rejected obviously all the temple stuff and so forth. His position was, it was Book of Mormon was true, period, end of story. That was the end of Joseph Smith's prophetic ministry. He was a fraud from that point on. So Richard Lloyd Anderson concluded that since David Whitmer never actually saw the translation process, that basically over the period of 40 or 50 years, when you're just going basically on hearsay, which is all that David Whitmer had because he never actually was a witness to the translation itself, you basically kind of remember things in a way that suits your prejudices. Mm-hmm. And so that's basically what Richard Lloyd Anderson's conclusion was, that David Whitmer sincerely believed, he wasn't a liar. He came to sincerely believe that it was all the seer stone, but he remembered it that way because it suited his theory. But so kind of the way that Rich Lloyd Anderson put it was that having left the church, he then remembered the translation account in a way that suited his theory of why it was that he left the church. And his theory was, I left the church because Joseph was a fallen prophet. Would that suit David Whitmer's theory? Because apparently he was like, Joseph Smith is a prophet until the Book of Mormon translated, right? So if he's messing with booklet,
it seems like if he's messing with the translation process, he's starting to detract from what he already knows, right?
So in his little booklet that he wrote, the way he describes the translation is he says that Joseph, Martin lost the pages, and then the Lord was very angry, and because of his transgressions, Joseph's transgressions, the angel refused to return the plates and the interpreters for him. I'm kind of paraphrasing him a little bit, but I'm very close to the way David Whitmer wrote it. So basically, it jived with his theory because it enabled him to argue that even when he was translating the Book of Mormon, Joseph was already starting to slip. He let Martin Harris take those pages and lose those pages. That was a sin. And already, even though he continued to translate with his seer stone, already Joseph was fallen because he had already disobeyed the Lord by letting Martin take the pages and then losing them. So he saw that as a transgression on Joseph's part. So you see, David Whitmer's argument is that Joseph was already on the slippery slope, even while he was still allowed to interpret the Book of Mormon. But he was already on the slope on his way down to being a fallen prophet.
Okay, so I know we've talked about a lot, and this is awesome. Unfortunately, we're gonna have to go here pretty soon. I want to make sure I'm smelling what you're stepping in, and I'm picking up what you're throwing down, right? So basically, all of those that hate us and want to self-aggrandize as though they've got some hidden gnosis of the true alternate history of the church and this stone in the hat theory, you're saying are recycling old lies that E.D. Howe and early anti-Mormons propagated based off of kind of self-congratulatory versions of the translation story that David Whitmer put together while he was kind of in his inactive years before he returned to the church, and we need not repeat these lies because they're not real history. Is that what you're saying?
No. Well, first of all, David Whitmer never returned to the church. He never.
Oh, okay. Yes. Okay. I'm sorry.
All right. He left. That's a whole nother story. No, he never came back to the church. No, I'm not saying that.
My understanding is you have three theories, right?
Right.
That you put in your book.
That's right. So basically, what we're saying. So what happened was that we stuck. The church went with Joseph and Oliver's, gold plates and Urim and Thummim interpreters account for most of its history. Then in the 1980s, you had the Mark Hoffman forgeries. And that got everybody on the track of saying, well, let's go back and look at the early history of the church. Was there, in fact, Mark Hoffman, was a forger, but let's go back and look and see if was there really any of this folk magic-y stuff going on. And so a guy named D. Michael Quinn wrote a book that was published right after the Hoffman forgery episodes called Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. And it was full of a ton of stuff. Mike Quinn was a prodigious researcher. He was a terrible analyst, but he was a prodigious researcher. So he found all kinds of stuff showing that in the Joseph Smith family environment, there was a lot of folk magic going on, and the Smith family kind of, played around with that.
Yeah, pretty cool. Based. Rock on.
So basically, after 1987, when Mike Quinn published Mormonism Magic Worldview, that started to become the question of the Joseph Smith's folk magic environment started to become very fashionable amongst LDS historians. And they dug out all of these old seerstone accounts. And, it was Emma Smith. It's not Martin Harris. That's dealt with in the book. I won't sidetrack us into that, but you shouldn't cite Martin Harris for this stuff because he was a Yerman Thummim guy when you get down to it. But David Whitmer, he was one of the three witnesses, who's to, you don't want to be calling him a total, complete 100% liar.
Yeah.
Because he remained true to his, vision of the, made him a three witness. He right up to his death, he attested to that. So you got to give him credit for that. So they started to dig, this stuff started to surface again. And people said, well, wait a minute, there's all these old accounts of the seerstone in the hat. What do we make of them? And basically, we shouldn't ignore them. We shouldn't pretend they don't exist, was the attitude of the historians. And so they started to research this stuff, and they found that, there was a lot of folk magic-y kinds of stuff going on around the Smith family at that time. And so, we can't pretend that it doesn't exist. We can't pretend that the Smiths weren't kind of into folk magic stuff, or the Smiths and all their neighbors were kind of not into this stuff. So the historians wanted to, present the full picture. So what happened was they said, we really ought to acknowledge all this stuff that David Whitmer said, these couple of accounts from Emma Smith, and this broader picture of the kind of folk magic-y, kind of superstitious environment that the Smiths and their neighbors lived in. Because, that's just the truth of the origins of the church, is that that's the kind of milieu that it came out of.
Great word. That's a really good word, my man.
So the folks that the Smiths and their neighbors, they were staunch Christians, firm Bible believers, but they also like to kind of play around with the old superstitions, the old English superstitions, and hey, we like to play around with them too. I mean, I don't know if any of you ever heard of a guy named Harry Potter?
Cool.
That stuff's very popular to this day in our society. So, you can't really criticize the Smiths for kind of being into that kind of stuff because, we're into it too.
And this diverges you because sometimes when people think, oh, the non-stone and hat people, then you're in the Hannah Stoddard camp. Where right. and her and a fair amount of other people, Shannon Tracy, who I talked to briefly in an episode, was very much like no magic stuff, no occulty type of stuff. But you're actually not that. You're kind of the between the two things.
Right. That's right. Our view and what we say in the book, it's in the book, is that it served a purpose because it kept because remember, the third train in the Smiths environment was the Enlightenment rationalism. I mean, Thomas Paine was, the atheists, they were, a few decades after the French Revolution. I mean, this was an era where you had kind of three layers. You had Enlightenment rationalism, almost atheism. Then you had devout Christian belief. And then you had this, cultural folk magic, old traditions. So all of those elements were in existence. And of course, the Enlightenment rationalization, the upper class people, that's what they were all into. So it was, and it eventually conquered our society. Now we're all Enlightenment rationalists. So what happened was that was very powerful force, even in the 1820s in the Joseph Smith and his family's environment. So by hanging on to the old kind of belief in folk magic stuff, what we argue is that it kept them open to the possibility of the supernatural.
Okay.
So that was what enabled when Joseph started to have visions. It enabled Joseph's family and their friends and neighbors to kind of just be, not just dismiss them like, oh no, I'm Descartes, this is not rational, this is not enlightened. It enabled their neighbors to be open to the idea that there might actually be angels and, God still speaking to mankind and prophets.
Okay.
So we see it as actually serving a useful function.
Okay, awesome. Now, unfortunately, we got to go here pretty soon, but I want to make sure that I'm wrapping my head around everything that you put out here. Okay. So just in just one sentence, what do you think the biggest misconception is about Stone in the Hat v. Urim and Thummim, and what is your fix that you talk about in your book by means of the Urim and Thummim? What's the one sentence boil down? The thesis, if you will,
give
bro.
Give me two
Okay,
sentences.
two sentences.
Please.
2 sentences, bro. Yeah.
Okay. The first sentence is Joseph and Oliver told the truth. The Book of Mormon was translated by the ancient Jaredite Nephite interpreters from the gold plates, just like Joseph and Oliver said in numerous statements published in writing during their lifetimes by themselves.
Okay.
That's number one. Number two is the Stone in the Hat accounts, came from people misunderstanding things that they saw. For example, one of the latest theories we have is that Joseph couldn't preserve his privacy. So what would he do if somebody burst in on them when he was translating with the plates and the interpreters? He'd hide the interpreters underneath and the plates underneath his hat. So,
And you've got to show us your hat, Jim.
What?
You've got to show the camera your hat.
The hat, this is the official
Urim and
Thummim hat.
And then the back.
And the back is a slash through the top hat, no stone in the hat.
Oh, that is funny.
So we got our merch too. And so that is the stone in the hat accounts. The people were sincere. They saw something, but they were mistaken.
Okay. So unfortunately, we got to go, but we're going to have you back. This is intriguing. I love it now. I feel like I'm in this kind of like Sharks versus Jets kind of thing. Like, oh, are you a Stone in the Hat guy? Or are you a Urim and Thummim guy? Yeah, you got something to say?
I'd like to make one more quick point here.
Okay, hit it.
Which is that, of course, Richard Bushman's provided a blurb for us for our book.
I'm digging. Yeah, I'm digging. I saw that.
If you look at that, there's a third possibility. And that is, it's fun to have teams, right? Republican, Democrat, Yankees, Red Sox, the U, the Y, Team Jacob, Team Edward. We love to have teams, right?
Solid reference.
Two sides. But in science and scholarship, there's actually a third way. And if you read Richard Bushman's blurb on our book, he's pointing to the third way. And that is, you come up with a hypothesis that kind of disagrees with what the people have said before, but you give your reasons, you give your research, you give your arguments. And the thing that you do is you don't want everybody to suddenly just divide into sides and instantly say, okay, I'm for A or I'm for B. The scientific and scholarly way to approach these is to say, that's an interesting hypothesis. That's well researched. Those arguments are reasonable. This could explain a lot of stuff, but we got to check it out some more. If you're in the physical sciences, you do experiments. If you're in history, you go back into the sources, you relook at the sources again, and you discuss the sources and you look at the new arguments and see if they explain things better. So I would argue that where we want to be, Jonathan and I want to be, is in that your belief in the seer stone in the hat, or you can't come up with some kind of compromise position. We just want Joseph and Oliver, their plates and interpreters' narrative to be in the mix as one of the working hypotheses. And because we feel that we do have an imbalance in LDS scholarship now, where people have gone too far over to the seer stone in the hat side, and we're trying to balance the boat, if you will, and say, okay, we know there's that seer stone in the hat sources, but let's not ignore Joseph and Oliver. Let's not ignore the traditional camp because it's got a lot of solid basis to it. So let's have all of our hypotheses out there, and then let's look up at the sources, and let's go back and dig back deep into the sources and try to look at them in context. And let's try to sort this out a little bit better than it is right now, where it's become totally one-sided on the seer stone and the hat.
Okay, awesome. So, ladies and gentlemen, you got to check out his stuff. It's pretty cool. We had Jonathan Neville in the studio already. That's his co-author here. The book is titled By Means of the Urim and Thummim. It's been quoted.
And use the subtitle too.
Okay. By means of the Urim and Thummim, restoring translation to the restoration. I see what you did there. It was clever. So again, his name is James Lucas, and shout out to Jonathan Neville. The book is By Means of the Urim and Thummim, restoring translation to the restoration. You can buy it wherever fine books are sold. We're going to have you back to talk more soon. And as always, guys, for this and more, please make sure you check us out at WardRadio.com.
Can't keep quiet when you start a riot.
Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. We assume if you made it this far that you liked our content. So please make sure that you smash that like button and you share this video with your friends. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet to our channel, please make sure that you subscribe and you press the alert button so you receive alerts on every one of our daily uploads. Now, we want to make sure that we keep all of this content flowing for free to you, the viewer. And to do that, we need your help. If you're a person of means, please consider a direct contribution through Venmo or through Zelle. And the links to those platforms will be in the description as well. Also, if you want to help us out, please make sure you buy some of our merch. We got really cool hats, really cool t-shirts for both boy and girl viewers, all available on WardRadio.com. And while you're there, you can sign up for our Ward Radio newsletter. You can receive all the really great Ward Radio news directly in your inbox simply by putting your email address in WardRadio.com. And finally, if you guys want to help out purchasing some of the equipment in the studio, you can always check out our Amazon wish list that is also available in the description of this video. And either way, whether you're pressing this button here to make sure you're subscribed to our channel, or whether you're watching another video here just because you like our stuff, we look forward to seeing you guys in the next program.